with Greenland's Blue Waters over the next month using the calculator and kind of helping share it a little bit. So definitely follow up with me if you're interested in learning more. And as well, the work will continue at LSP, and George Booty will be the main contact for that. So I have some of that information, but I just wanted to share that straight off the bat. So I just had a quick slide about LSP. I'm sure most people know what it is, but just in case this gets shared, we are a membership-based organization, mostly working in Minnesota, but also working on some policy outside of Minnesota. So I am housed within the Community-Based Food Systems program, originally through the Chippewa 10% project. And this is just kind of an image of a lot of our partners through that. And this is a watershed initiative based in West Central Minnesota. Throughout my time, it's definitely expanded from just West Central Minnesota and now doing more work throughout, but definitely started there. So the thinking behind the calculator was definitely, you know, we were talking a lot with farmers about using cover crops or perennials or some of these different aspects of changing their crop rotations. And a lot of people would ask, well, how much would this cost me? And how is this going to impact my financial bottom line? And so when I was brought on, I looked at all of the different crop tools already out there, and there were a lot, including from Iowa, the grass-fed beef calculator from the Wallace Center, as well as the NRCS tool on cover crop economics. So we kind of assessed what was already out there and made sure that we were not going to reinvent the wheel. So looking at what these tools did, we were confident that the tool that our farmers were asking for was still something that we could create that wasn't already there. So that was our main goal. So the basics of what is the calculator. It is an Excel-based tool to help farmers look at the differences in the financials between two crop rotations. So you can compare an original to something new that you may be trying. So that's a lot of times how we think about it. And you can compare up to 6 years within a rotation, and the two don't have to be the same. So you could do a corn soy rotation with, you know, a 6 years of full perennials or something to that effect. So there are two completely unique things, and the tool does take into account whole farm financials. So that you have your hired labor, your property taxes, things like that that don't change depending on what crop you're growing. And then there are the crop specific costs, and those are what are specified throughout the tool. So it is free, shared by the Land Stewardship Project through our website. We ask for just some basic information in return. Once you download the calculator, you can use the financial part completely offline. So you don't need access to the internet at all once you have it on your computer, which is great for, you know, if you're going to work in a rural area that you might not have access at somebody's home or something like that. I'll go into it, but we just released an update that looks at soil erosion, and you do need internet for that. So that's a little bit of a change, but the calculator has built-in crop options that you can load so that you don't have to know all of the figures yourself. The idea is that you could test something that you've never used before. And those, we have defaults built in for West Central Minnesota, so that's the Chippewa River watershed region where we originally started with the work, as well as southeastern Minnesota in the Minnesota region of the Drift. And for that area, we have both organic and non-organic figures. And then we recently released a couple of months ago a Illinois version of the calculator. And that one actually is divided into northern, central, and southern Illinois. And we used a lot of the farm doc budgets for references for those. And one thing about that is that some of those are limited in what crop options were available to a lot of the traditional row crop rotations. So we actually ended up using the Iowa Ag Decision Makers crop budgets as well to fill in some of the perennial options for Illinois. So that's where a lot of the defaults come from. we have a grazing interface within the calculator, and that comes from the Wallace Center's grass-fed beef calculator with some updated prices, but the majority of that interface comes from that. So with that, I'll kind of take you a little bit through some images from the tool. So it's housed on our website on landstewardshipproject.org, and there's a landing page for it with some information. Like I said, there's some general information that it asks to enter, just so that we can keep track of who's downloading it, and then make sure that when there are updates, like the one we actually just sent out yesterday, everybody who is using the calculator can get that. So that's just why we ask for some of that basic information. And so we can look at the full version in a minute on the actual Excel file, but I've pulled some screenshots of the important points. So these are the snapshots, and we'll kind of see how it comes together on the full page shortly. So this is the beginning of the interface. The general idea throughout the tool is that you follow the yellow boxes. Anything highlighted in yellow is to be entered by the user. And so we see you begin with your location, and then looking at the number of acres of your whole farm to get some of those, whole farm financial figures narrowed down to a single per acre cost. And then looking at number of acres to compare. If that's that field that's a 40, if that's those 10 acres that you have that you might not want to plant this year in corn, or if that's, your whole farm, which you're looking to transition to a perennial system, that's the number of acres to compare. So then we can see you move on to enter the number of years you'd like to look at, and then designing your crop rotation. So this is an image that I took from the example we'll look at shortly. With it being a forage working group, I try to put in some perennials in there and have it be applicable to those on this call. So we see that those are 2 different years that we're comparing. You can do up to 3 crops in a single year, with the idea that, like the first year of the new crop plan in year 1, chances are you're not going to do more than a cash crop, cover crop, and then graze it. So I know that there is a chance, Southern Illinois, you can maybe fit 1 more crop in there. But there is an option for double crop soybean in the defaults that we have, but this is what we thought was reasonable. So we start here, and then we start clicking the button, click to financial figures, and that will open up new work pages on the bottom of the screen, and we'll follow those across to the right to complete the tool. So the next page that will open up, we can see here that there's those year 1, year 2, year 3, all of those at the bottom of the screen. That's what we would use to continue to fill it out. And this is what each of those pages look like. This is the broad overview. There's the same idea that you follow the boxes in yellow throughout. Going up close, we can see that there's the whole farm figures here, and these all come from a Schedule F tax form. So if you're working with somebody that has that form handy and feels comfortable sharing it with you, you could just fill those straight in for the whole farm, and it'll calculate it out per acre. Those are filled in once on the first year and then carried throughout the tool. You never have to do that again. So those are there. The original crop plan has 2 options, or there's the original and then there's the new, and you fill in the crop specific costs. We have here the seed, the fertilizer, all of those. I've found that when working with farmers, they can fill those in basically an instant. They know those down to the penny. And there are defaults, and it's really easy to fill in the defaults in the beginning and then let people launch off from that and say, oh, I don't pay $120 for seed. My cost is $108.56 or whatever. But I found that launching from defaults is a really great way to work with people on that. So once you do fill in all of your years, the returns come back on that original input sheet where you built your rotation, and there's a summary of the year by year. And it breaks down expenses, income, and returns with a yearly average on the bottom. I think that especially when you're looking at perennials, the year-by-year breakdown is really great at telling some of the story of why it's a challenge for people to do perennials, especially when we look at that new crop plan. Your overall income may be higher based on the defaults that I ran in this tool, but the year to year changes a lot. So one year you might be losing money, the next year you might be making a lot. So I always like to look at that that part of the tool because I think it's a big part of the story. There is also a section that's just the overall average throughout the rotation. So comparing the two to each other, what are the expenses, what are the incomes, and what are the differences? So that's the main calculator. One thing that is important to this group too is looking at grazing. So there is a grazing interface. I just released a Mac version of the calculator that does not have the grazing interface or the defaults in it. Unfortunately, the way that Mac views some of the programming I use, it's not allowed. It's seen as a potential virus threat. So because of that, you can still enter all of your budget information, but you're gonna have to bring your own numbers to the table. So this in both the Minnesota calculator and the Illinois defaults, there's grazing values. We can see kind of behind the pop-up box image, there's those # NAs. That's always the signal that the grazing information is still to be entered. That's kind of the reminder there. So there's the button right above that that says enter grazing values. And so once you do that, this will pop up. Within grazing, you have the option of picking your management style. And this determines what the stocking density will be. So we worked with Brad Hines at University of Minnesota at Morris, and he's done a lot of research on what kind of dry matter yields are based on management style. So that's where we got the information for that. We also have field dimensions. A lot of people get hung up on this, and we wanted to be able to measure to help calculate what the cost of a fencing was, because we know that is a big cost. I would recommend when people use this with people, don't get too hung up on this section. Just do a general estimate, get people through it, and it's all easier after this. So I find that these two numbers are kind of the biggest challenge when thinking about a field. So I entered in here 1320 by 1320, and that is kind of the perimeter of a square 40. So that's what that is. Next, you have the option to pick the type of grazing. These come from the grass-fed beef calculator, like I said, with the addition of custom grazing and short-term, which are both really great for grazing cover crops. Short-term grazing is something that we came up with after working with farmers. There was, a lot of the other ones assume that they're either going to be grazing this field or they're going to be fed hay. And that's kind of how it takes it into account. So short-term grazing is really great to treat yourself like your own custom grazer. So you can look at, what's the value of having these cows on this cover crop or on this field for just a short period of time. You can still look at that in a way that's less detailed than what Meghan's tool will cover. So hers is a great addition to this. A box pops up that also has some defaults in it for each of the crops or each of the types of cattle with some questions built in to kind of get what all of the figures will be: days grazing, costs, some of those things. So after that, there's just a little reminder because unless the crop is perennial pasture, it will assume that the crop is going to be harvested. So this is just a reminder of make sure that you're not counting your income twice. A lot of times the biggest thing that I see is that the stocking density estimates are a little bit higher than what people are seeing on their farm. So on the right side, we can see the grazing expenses are now filled in. The way that it worked in order to be able to compare cattle to row crops on a per acre basis and to kind of make that understandable to the computer is we have underseed cost is cost per acre. Yield per acre is the stocking density, so how many animal units per acre it can hold, and then price is price per head. So we can see here that this was MERG, and it's estimating just about a 2 animal unit per acre stocking density. If a farmer says, you know, that's too high, I get about 1.5 or 1.2, you can edit your entered values and go and manually change that. There are some calculations that go on behind the scenes. So being able to use this pop-up box to easily do it will ensure that all of the numbers are being changed versus changing it directly on the box. So I've gone over some of these things, but we did a lot of testing with farmers that we work with, which was really important to make sure that you know, the terminology is correct. I don't personally have a row crop farming background, so especially, you know, just changing a word from hot count weight to hanging weight or little things like that throughout the tool was really important in making this useful. And that was really helpful in the initial process. So there's a lot of different ways that farmers that we've worked with have used the calculator, from, you know, looking at adding just something as simple as cover crops to a rotation, you know, diversifying or transitioning to a full perennial system. Those are all really great ways, as well as you can also use it to look at changing your grazing management style. So looking at going from continuous to a basic rotational or a MERG. Those are all really great ways to use the calculator. So just released yesterday is our soil erosion interface. This is something that we've been working on for a while and was really made possible because of work done by another LSP employee. We knew that this only measured the financials, and we had farmers that would come to us and say, you know, yeah, I get this, but it's not telling the whole story. And we completely agreed. So we kind of wanted to help give them another tool to look at what are some of the other benefits that they're getting. So that's where soil erosion came in, which is, you know, big problem in Minnesota, like a lot of other places. This is the work that was done by Steve Ewist, another former LSP employee. He created GIS-based tools to look at soil erosion by water. He also has one for the mussel equation and a single storm. If you're interested in those, you can, you know, and if you have GIS capabilities, you can email George and he'd be happy to share some information on those. But him doing the legwork on this is really what made it possible for me to adapt this exact work into an Excel-based version. So we now have this soil erosion by water calculator. This is what the interface looks like. It's housed within the same tool. Like I said, all 3 versions have it. It's also follow the yellows, same as the financial side of things. And it's based on the Russell equation. So the main things to be entered are the tillage method. So the rotations transferred from the original page. You add in your tillage method, and that will give you the main crop factors based on what are you growing and how are you working with your soil. In addition to that, the farm location is the next factor, which gives us the rainfall factor. And for that, there are defaults for Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, I believe. I'm not 100% sure about Indiana now that I said that, but there's defaults for every county in every one of those states. And if you enter that, the rainfall factor will just pop back. The length slope factor, I think, was the biggest challenge. So there's little, those red corners mean that their comments are there telling you how to look at some of that information. And that's basically when you're looking at your field, when you can see visible runoff, what's the length of that slope in the general percent. So that's the length slope factor. Steve created a map for the soil type that made it possible so that you can go and just enter your address, pick you where you are anywhere in the United States, and it'll give you that figure. And then you have your planting direction, and if you use strip cropping as that last factor. So this is that map, just an image of that. And we can see I use this for Olmsted County, provided me with a figure of 0.3 that I entered back into this. So those are the only factors, and these are the results that it provides back to you. So we adapted it so that you get your results in tons per acre of soil erosion by water. And then we also have it for dump truck loads, which we have a little note saying what size dump truck. And then also of depth of, how many inches or what portion of an inch of topsoil are you losing. So we have that for every crop for every year, and then averages throughout, which, this is that corn soy versus the perennial system. And you can definitely see when you look at the averages throughout the whole rotation, 9 tons of soil loss versus half of a ton of soil loss. You can definitely see some of the impacts that are other than just financial with this equation. So that's really great. We also have, in addition to that, to calculate some of the nutrients that you're losing from the field. So if you know your soil organic matter figure, you can enter your percent in if based on soil testing what you have. And then based on that and what your soil loss is, it'll tell you how many pounds of nutrients you're losing per acre on average. So for that, there's the carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, which I think is another really great way to visualize it. My goal in designing this, as somebody who is not science is not my strongest suit. And so I was coming at it from somebody who doesn't really understand what the Russell equation is to begin with anyways. I really wanted to provide a lot of different ways that somebody could understand this information, and so that in looking at it, there's like one thing that somebody would identify with. So maybe it's not that they're going to lose 1/10 of an inch of soil, but maybe it's losing 50 pounds of nitrogen every year. So that was really my goal in designing this interface. So that is the main presentation. I'll go to the file now, and we can take a look. This is the blank file and what it looks like. We can see this is how the drop downs work with these little arrows that that's throughout the tool. That's the biggest thing, is always look for those arrows, as well as these buttons throughout. So I'll open up a page here just to show you, but this is the main page of what the input form looks like. Based on what your crop rotation is, some of these will be highlighted yellow to show you what you need to enter, but if you don't need to enter anything, the yellow is hidden. I will quickly, just to show you, fill in, just to show you how the defaults work. So I'll just go back to this year one. All I did was quickly enter in soybeans after corn, and there's this button up here that's fill all defaults. That fills everything in, and that's kind of the easiest way for people to launch off of things. So let's see, there's a great question. Purchase nutrients values. So right now in the soil erosion calculator, we don't have that. That sounds like a really great thing to add. And something that's pretty easy. If you do know that, you could add that in. So that wasn't something that we were able to include in this version just because of some time constraints. So right now we do have the amount. So we struggled a lot with, adding some of those economic values to nutrients. And it's one of those hard things, because we all know that you can purchase some of those nutrients, but then we also all know that soil is worth a lot more than just repurchasing those nutrients. So we decided to just give the pure pounds loss in this version. So here's a quick, this is the one that I filled out yesterday. So this has, for southeastern Minnesota, some soybeans and corn versus the perennial system. And within this, I entered 3 different types of grazing. So I don't quite have the page in front of me, but I believe it's stocker cattle with continuous, cow-calf with basic rotational, and feeder to finish direct marketed, sold non-processed, so just like a portion, like 1/4 of a cow or something, in Merg style grazing. So those were all filled in, and each of the years here are visible with all of the results here. And then each page, at the bottom of each page, it does have that year's summary. So you don't have to go back to the first page in order to see the results, but we can go back to the original rotation page, and that is where I found both of those year by year and the financials. So I think that's most of what I have. Now we do have some time for questions if people have any. I know that I went through it really fast, covered a lot, and didn't really do a full walkthrough of the calculator. But if you have specific questions on aspects, let me know, and I'd be happy to clarify things.
Rebecca, I have a couple broad general questions.
Mm-hmm.
Not based on the people who helped you, not based on the producers who did your, I'll call it beta testing, but on producers who have actually sat down to use this to make a decision. What has their response been?
Yeah, I think it's kind of been a varied of responses. So, you know, one of my favorite stories is actually a farm that I used to have a CSA from. They had land and they were deciding what they were going to do with it. Extra land in addition to their CSA, and they had a lamb business. And they used the calculator to pencil out, you know, just themselves. They used the calculator to pencil out a couple of different situations, if it was alfalfa, if it was mixed perennials, or if it was cattle. And they ended up finding that, you know, well-managed cattle was the best option panning out for them, as well as fitting with their financial goals, as well as their environmental goals of regenerating that soil. So that's kind of one of my favorite anecdotes, but I am a little biased because I had a CSA with them for 3 years. But we've definitely had a lot of different results to it. So like Jane said, it's not the quickest thing to fill out. So if you are going to look at something like a 6-year rotation, you do have to be prepared to spend a little bit of time with it and enter in some information. I really enjoy a quote somebody told me once that they said, if you put in honest answers, you'll get honest answers back. So there have been times that people have put in things and said, you know, been shocked that they're making less money on soybeans than they thought they were. Or something like that. And so, you know, sometimes it was challenged, and sometimes that was because of taking whole farm figures into account, and sometimes that was based on just the realities of markets right now. So we've had kind of a wide range of reactions. I enjoy, somebody else said that it was easier to use than some of the other budget tools out there. So I take that as a compliment, because you know, it's 6 years of looking at financials. It's not easy, but I tried to make it as easy as possible. So,
have you had any corn and soybean producers who have made radical changes to their operation because of this?
You know, I don't know if solely based on the calculator's response. I don't know if I've heard an anecdotal story like that. You know, it's one of those things too that partially let it into the internet world and it goes where it wants to go. But we've definitely had people that, you know, changed a grazing mix a little bit based on it, added some cooler season varieties. We did have somebody that turned a low producing soy field into a pasture for their sheep business. So there are definitely some stories, and The pure corn and soy, you know, we did use it with one of the farmers that we work with in our networks who is a small grains, and he wasn't strictly corn soy. He was a 4-year rotation, but he definitely did. He was surprised by the gains that he was seeing in using cover crops when he actually panned it out financially of the yield impacts and saving on, you know, machinery and a path of cultivating. So when he actually panned it out, he was surprised that there was more of a financial impact than he expected.
And approximately how many producers do you think have sat down and really used this, or do you have a way to track that?
You know, that's definitely a hard thing for me to track. So a lot of like what Jane said, and especially like what we're doing today, I think the value of this tool is really when there are facilitators sitting down next to somebody and using it with them, or, you know, sharing it with people in their networks. And we do track our downloads. We have, you know, about a third of our downloads are farmers themselves, but then the other 2/3 are, you know, it may be a researcher, or it may be, you know, a lot of people who are working with farmers, a lot of SWCD agents, NRCS, things like that. And I have heard from them of, you know, using it with producers directly. I have not been able to get an exact count on what some of those numbers are of people sharing it, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for the questions, Kent.
Rebecca, there was a question from Robert Bauer that came into the chat box asking if you could go to the grazing details tab to reference the details behind those 3 years. And Robert, if you want to unmute yourself and maybe explain a little more what your question is.
Yeah.
Well, Rebecca was kind of just saying, I can't recall the details there. Maybe I'm wondering if in that tab you could see what those are.
Yeah, definitely. I'll open it up to grazing. Here, let's see. I'll go to the 3rd year. This tab was not the best designed. It was always on the list of things that I would have loved to redesign, but didn't quite have time in my day to do. So this is kind of how we calculate those figures. And I would say that definitely for a farmer, this is difficult to understand. But if you're really familiar with some of that background information on cattle, then it might be a breeze. So starting out at the top, we have how those fencing costs are calculated. And those are some of the assumptions behind that is that you're purchasing all new equipment and keeping it for 5 years. So that cost is amortized per acre per year. You know, I know a lot of people keep things for more than 5 years. That's not that long of a lifespan for a polywire movable fence. But that's just, you know, a conservative estimate to add that cost in. So if we continue down looking at it, this is for stocker. A lot of those things that we entered are sent over here. So we can look at, you know, purchased, what you're purchasing them for, coming in at, what weight, what you're selling them for up top, continuing down to how we're calculating that stocking density, and as well as, you know, the price of that dry matter. So calculating, you know, how much dry matter do you need? How much are they getting based on what that management style is kind of up in the middle, followed by, you know, how many days are they grazing? How much pasture do they need per animal? Continued by some of the non-pasture costs down below, and then all the way down at the bottom, we have cost per animal, animal sale price, you know, looking at then all of those final figures of stocking densities, cost per acre, and then finally the returns to management, which is this figure then is transferred back to this page. So it's worked in with those overhead costs and some of the land rent down to the returns here. So like each grazing has this sheet that comes up. This one was stocker. Each one is different. This is cow-calf, which is a little bit different and has, addition the sale of cull cows and what that income is, and some of those factors as well that are unique to this situation. And then another one, this is just the short-term grazing, which is pretty simple. Number of days grazing. What's the value of that? So yeah, those are the grazing detail sheets. Like I said, I wish I'd been able to make those as understandable as the input sheets. But
I think those are really great. Thanks for explaining that. Rebecca, could you clarify, how does the adding in grazing affect the overhead costs? So how is that fencing cost translated over to the other sheet?
So we have, this is year 3, and the fencing cost is added into this figure here, the seed cost. That's, in addition to any medicines needed, vet costs, any other cost, bringing in hay or feed for the winter. That's all added into that figure there. It doesn't change the overall whole farm figures at all, which is definitely, these are average. The whole farm figures are averaged from, well, for the Minnesota version, it's the Finbin system is where we get our defaults. And so there's whole farm figures for each of the crops within our calculator, and we kind of averaged those out. So they, won't perfectly reflect everybody, but they're definitely a really great way to start and launch off from. And so those do take into account some people that have cattle and some people that don't. So, you might have a different electrical bill or utilities if you have cattle versus if you don't, things like that. So, that's one of those things that.
Oh, I'm sorry. When a producer compares the original crop and the new crop, is that right that you use the same total overhead expenses? In other words, it doesn't. You don't account for the cost of that fence in the overhead. You account for it in the maybe those operating expenses. Is that right?
Yep, exactly. Yep. So it's all in order to compare things on a per acre basis within the same, not needing to create all of its own categories for grazing. We just lumped all of those costs together and added them into the seed option. That's kind of where they get sent. Although they are detailed on, when you're entering them, all of those figures show up. And the thing with fencing, having it be divided over each acre, over each year, I think this comes out to about $6. So, in the scheme of cattle, it's a relatively small figure, although the upfront cost is quite high in the deterrent. One thing that I wanted to add as well is that I really see this tool as part of the conversation and a great way to get general ideas of what the financial figures are. I think no matter how diligent you are with this, you're not going to get an exact figure back of the exact same income or expenses that you have from the last year on your farm. Just because there's always things that aren't unaccounted for. But this is a really great way to give general ideas of what the trends are and the idea behind what would the potential financials look like if I switched. So, and same with the soil erosion as well. It's not, a guarantee that you're only going to lose half of a ton of soil each year based on this loss, but it gives you a general idea of that story of what happens in different rotations. So that is just one thing that I wanted to add. There any other final questions? Otherwise, it's just about time to shoot over to Megan.
Yep. Okay, Megan, thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah.
for that presentation
Yeah.
and for answering all the questions. Megan, are you ready to roll?
Sure am. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Loud and clear.
Perfect. I'm now the presenter. Excellent. And can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. I will enlarge it. Okay, so I want to follow up to Rebecca's calculator tool and get down to really the nitty-gritty of the forage value of cover crops when they're grazed specifically or harvested mechanically. So I worked on creating a grazing cover crops economic tool that is available on Iowa State's Ag Decision Maker website. So really, I'm talking about grazing cover crops, how they've been farmer tested and cow approved through our on-farm research on collecting data and analyzing the economic analysis for the forage value of cover crops. So, okay, so really the impetus of this calculator stemmed from doing work with cow-calf and feedlot producers on the economic impact of grazing cover crops. So I had these farmers keep records. We're now in our 3rd year, so keep all of their records on grazing cover crops and on their costs and hours associated with establishing those cover crops. So as of now, I have a report out, which you can see on the screen, that has analyzed 2 years worth of cover crop grazing. I'm currently working on getting data from this last fall 2017, spring 2018 to incorporate to this report. And that report can be found at the link below. So I am not an economist. And so as I was collecting this data and entering it into my own made Excel sheets, I realized that there are a lot of numbers here and that I would be better off if I partnered with an economist to double check the numbers that I was collecting and the Excel sheets that I had formed. So I partnered with William Edwards, who's a retired economist at Iowa State, who has spent his career working on different calculator tools that are available for free on the Ag Decision Maker website through Iowa State University. And I really like the option of having this, my new calculator tool posted on this website, because many farmers know about it and use it. So like Rebecca said, they tried not to reinvent the wheel. I know that there are other cover crop economic tools that exist, specifically one through NRCS. I've had some experience using the NRCS tool. I do think there are a lot of questions asked that farmers don't know off the top of their head. And I wanted to specifically look at the forage value of cover crops. So this tool complements other tools, and it's really to specifically get down at the forage value that cover crops offer. So the tool can be found on this Iowa State page, and you then on the left-hand side, you choose crops. Under crops, there's a cost and return tab, and it's under the profitability tab. And here's the home page for the economics of cover crops tool. There's other resources linked on this website. So there's a couple fact sheets from Practical Farmers of Iowa. There's an Iowa Learning Farms, and Iowa State also has fact sheets available on this website. So these resources are available to supplement the economic tool. So when you open the tool, you will see this is the introduction page, the home page. So I want to be clear that this tool has 3 different tabs that get at different results. So I am specifically going to go through that last tab called Grazing Cover Crops Results. And this is for analyzing actual economic costs and benefits that farmers, through farmer data that they have collected. So the other 2 tabs, one is Grazing Cover Crops Budget. So this would be looking forward. If you want to graze cover crops and want to get an estimate or idea of the value of that forage, you would use this budgeting tool. And then the most basic of these 3 tools is the cover crops budget. So this is for analyzing projected costs and benefits of cover crops without grazing or harvesting. So it's basically a simplified version of what I am going to walk you through step by step. So I want to end this show for now and actually open up the Excel file that I'm going to walk you through. Okay, so this file is the actual costs and returns with grazing and or harvesting. So this is the last tab on that Excel file. So I have just come up with a very simple example to walk through. So really, we just start with producer name and enter a year. Then let's see here. So we have included up to 5 different fields of cover crops. Most farmers working within corn and soybean systems don't have more than 5 different cover crop fields or 5 different cover crop seed mixes. So we just start on row 11 here. We start with type of cover crop seeded. This is just for you to keep track. This doesn't auto-populate any sort of information. And then we enter total acres of cover crop seeded. So I started with a 50-acre field of cereal rye, a 40-acre field of cereal rye and turnips, and a 25-acre field of oats. So then we go into the specific costs for establishing each cover crop or cover crop mix in each field. So William Edwards has broken this down to, you can enter costs in for 2 different seed types. If you have a 5-way mix, even a 10-way mix, you could just lump that cost together and enter it into one of those cells. So I stated that cereal rye is going to cost $10 an acre, cereal rye and turnips $10. So the cereal rye $10 an acre, the turnips $11 an acre, and oats is $9 an acre. So then it further breaks down these costs into the cost of establishment, so seeding or drilling, or aerial seeding or drilling. So you can break that down into a custom rate if you've hired this out, or a rate that you would charge yourself if you're seeding it. There's also an option there for the value of operator labor. So that cost would then be associated with your seeding or drilling if you did it yourself in line 16. So I have put down that this farmer hired the seeding of the cover crop at $15 an acre, which is pretty standard. I also want to point out that this operator labor cost was generated from the Iowa Farm custom rate survey. Every year, Iowa State puts out a custom rate survey of the average costs for all of the practices on farms, not specific to crop farms. So $15 an acre is the going rate for 2018. So we'll go down to this next section here, which is added costs for terminating the cover crop. So we know that cover crop costs are establishment and termination. So that's how we've broken this up. So our added costs for terminating the cover crop, and in parentheses, this says beyond normal practices. So some farmers have told me that they terminate their cover crop at the same time they would be going in to do a pre-plant burn down. So they have to be very specific on what to charge to the cover crop enterprise and what to charge to their cropping enterprise. So that's why we use specific terminology on beyond normal practices. And you'll see in row 22, we said additional herbicide applied for termination. So if you were not already going to apply that herbicide for pre-plant burn down, then we need to associate that cost with the cover crop enterprise. So for this example, the termination herbicide costs $13 an acre on fields 1 and 2. Oats winter kill, therefore there was no spring termination costs for the oats. Now there's also a line for applying additional herbicides at a custom rate or if done by yourself. I took this from the Iowa custom rate survey, and the average is $6.50 an acre for spraying herbicide. So I added that to field 1 and field 2. You can see in the right-hand side that the cost for termination added up to $1,755. So then there's another section for other costs. There's a section for the yield impact on the cash crop following your cover crop. So a lot of farmers have been asking, what if I get a bushel or 2 more per acre, what is that worth financially? So here is a section to enter that. I had put that soybeans were planted in field 1 following the cover crop, corn in fields 2 and 3. I put in an average bushels per acre for each of those crops and an average selling price for each of those crops. So then I also entered the expected percent yield change. This is a positive or a negative yield change, so a gain or a loss. And this was pulled from Alejandro Palestino's research. He's an economist at Iowa State. So there's a expected 2% yield boost in soybeans planted after a cover crop. And in corn, a lot of times we found that there's either no yield change or potentially a yield drag. So on one of those fields, I put a 0% yield change, and another field I put a negative 1% change, so a loss of 1%. And you can see that the net value of those yield impacts per acre is listed there in row 36, and then this totals over all of the acres $425 value. So in rows 38 through 41, this is an area to enter potential cost share per acre that you may be receiving. In Iowa, we also have a crop insurance premium discount for acres that have had cover crops. It's $5 an acre of a discount. So I had, for this example, listed that fields 1 and 3 were receiving $25 an acre cost share from their local NRCS, county NRCS office. And then I had listed field 2 as getting $15 an acre cost share per acre. There's also a separate row for acres in your field that are receiving the cost share payment, because not all acres within one field receive that cost share. So we parse that out so you're able to specify the number of acres. For this example, the number of acres are the same as the total acres planted in cover crop, meaning they were all eligible for that cost share. So then you can see on the right-hand side that that cost share revenue was $2,475 for this year. There's also a section for other added or reduced costs. So lines 44 through 46, there's cash rent paid if acres are rented just for seeding cover crops. So this could be in a custom grazing situation that a cattle owner may pay a farmer to rent acres to plant cover crops. There's also, so line 46, other reduced costs due to cover crops. A farmer may enter revenue generated from cash renting out acres for cover crops. So those are just other lines for additional potential revenues or costs associated with your cover crops. So now we will go down to this next section, which is all about grazing, and this is where things get really fun. So we start off with trying to estimate the added labor that is necessary for the grazing of cover crops. So a lot of farmers would have already been grazing corn stalks if cover crops were not present. And that's why we specified extra labor needed to move cattle or to move temporary fences. So this is the labor on top of what you would already be doing if you were grazing corn stalks, or, you know, if you were just feeding your cattle normally and not grazing cover crops over the fall, winter, and spring. So for this example, this farmer needed 20 hours of extra labor to move cattle. That's the spring and fall combined, and 12 total hours of extra labor needed to move temporary fencing. So there was some rotational grazing within the cover crops, and that's what that 12 hours was. And then, of course, again, we have to incorporate the value of operator labor, and that's was $15 per hour. Again, that was pulled from the Iowa Custom Rate Farm Survey. So you can see on the right here that that labor totaled $480. So then we have our added investments for grazing cover crops. This is fencing and watering. And so this, we break this out into exterior fencing and interior fencing. And I don't know why I can't, there we go, I can move the screen now. So as you can see, there are links on the right-hand side, and there are specific cost estimate breakdowns. So we can see what woven wire, barbed wire, and high tensile and poly wire cost per foot. This is these are William Edwards numbers from a Iowa State fencing fact sheet. And then we can also see the expected lifespan of these. So really, this spreadsheet prorates these costs, which you'll see here once I get to it. Okay. All right. Why can I not? Okay, back to it. All right, so we see that we have some exterior fencing in field 1, and in field 2 and field 3, that exterior fencing was already there. We didn't have to add new fencing. So I put this in at 89 cents per foot. That's for high tensile 5-wire, and that's the cost. So the estimated life of that fence is 25 years. It auto-populates the estimated feet of fence needed for the acres that I had entered previously. Then we also have added interior fencing to graze these cover crops. So in fields 1, 2, and 3, I added some poly wire. That's an estimated lifespan of 4 years, and there were 2 divisions within each field. So then this estimated the feet of interior fencing needed, and then here in row 63, our estimated annual depreciation and interest for adding fencing. So that totals $1,063 over this year. I also, because field 1 in this example was new to grazing and we had to put up fence, we also needed to add a waterer. I added $500 for that waterer. There's also a line that estimates the annual depreciation and interest for the added waterers. So for that year, that waterer cost us $81. So then you can see that our total added annual costs for fence and waterers was a total of $1,145. So scrolling down, this is where we really get at the specifics of the feed value or the forage value of cover crops when grazed. So for this year, I entered estimated farm value of equivalent quality hay. So I estimated that hay is going at $115 per ton. And this is, to wrap your head around this estimate, this is the cost of feed that you would have to pay if you were not grazing cover crops. So this could be per ton, the cost per ton of DDGs, corn silage, whatever your winter feed is. In this example, I'm using hay at $115 per ton. And that hay is a 90% at 90% dry matter. So this is these boxes we'll come back to later, because it is pretty striking to change the cost per ton and see how our forage values fluctuate. So then this is where we get to the nitty-gritty of grazing. We have broken it down into fall grazing and into spring grazing. So both fall grazing and spring grazing are going to ask for the exact same information. But I'll point out the specifics of where it may differ. So we have our type of cattle or name of group grazing, 2 groups of dry cows and a group of bulls grazed on fall cover crops. So the number of head being grazed in row 74, and then the average weight of these animals, pounds per head. So I had a group of dry cows at 1,300 pounds, a group of dry cows at 1,200 pounds, and bulls at 1,600. So then this automatically populates the dry matter consumption needed per day in pounds for each group of cattle. This is using a 4% dry matter intake, and that 4% is incorporating wastage, trampling, and any sort of buffer. And I'll get to that when I go back to my PowerPoint and show exactly how we pulled that 4% number. But we feel pretty confident in using 4%. It's a number from an NRCS fact sheet. I will also say that this number, if you wanted to change it to 2.5%, 3%, and not necessarily incorporate wastage or potential forage that's trampled, you're welcome to change that within this formula bar. And it is a protected sheet, but anyone is free to unprotect their sheet and go in and change that number to a number you feel most comfortable with. So then we enter our grazing data that we've had farmers collect for us. So you enter your date that the fall grazing period began. So for group 1, they were turned out on December 13th, and then they left that field on January 6th. And you can see these dates listed for all 3 groups. And then it populates the number of grazing days that grazing period was. So then in row 80, this is an important row to take into consideration. So this is the estimated % of feed needs provided by other feed or residue. So if there are corn stalks out there, you will want to estimate or have your farmer estimate how much of their cattle's ration is coming from corn stalks versus the cover crop. If they feed any sort of supplement, or if they also let them into pasture at night and then let them back into the cover crops during the day, you need to, or the farmer needs to estimate how much of their total ration is coming from those other sources. So here, cattle are grazing corn stalks, and I estimated that 25% of their feed needs are coming from those corn stalks. The other two fields were in soybean. There's not as much residue there, so I estimated 10%. But so these percentages are specifically coming from the crop residue. The farmer is not also supplementing them with another feed source. So by entering all of these numbers, then we estimate the tons of feed that is needed for the grazing period, which we see is 58.5 to feed all of these animals. And then this breaks it down to the estimated tons of feed provided specifically by the cover crops in the fall grazing period. And that's 49.4 tons of dry matter. So we can see how many tons are needed to feed our animals and how many tons they are potentially getting from the cover crop themselves. So if these numbers were changed to 0, it would, the calculator tool would think that all of the feed needs were provided by the cover crop. So we go down to spring grazing and we see the same exact thing. So now we have a group of lactating cows because they've calved, and a group of dry cows prior to calving. So you can see that these grazing dates, those dry cows were let out on March 25th and presumably calving on pasture, and then left that field on April 11th, and then moved to another field of cover crops on the 12th and grazed that for about 2 weeks till April 27th. At that time, they were lactating. Something to point out is that these dry cows were 1,200 pounds, and then I upped their weight by 150 pounds because I am incorporating the calf weight there. I would like to let each educator use their discretion on how they want to account for calves on the ground. I think when calves are just born and weigh between 100 and 200 pounds, that weight could be potentially added to this cell here, or you could up the percent dry matter intake for lactation and allow that to cover the calf. If in some situations that I've had to run examples, there have been groups of calves that are fall born and they're grazing and they're 500 pounds. And in that case, I create another whole individual group for those calves at 500 pounds and enter a percent dry matter intake for those calves. So I keep individual grazing records for the calves. So now you can see in row 96 that this is the estimated tons of feed provided by cover crops in the fall plus the spring grazing periods. And that's this number in row 82 plus this number in row 94. So for this example, the cover crops provided us 69 tons of dry matter. That 69 tons of dry matter is then multiplied by the $115 per ton in what we would be spending to feed them. And we get to our summary of grazing value. So this is a very important aspect of this spreadsheet. So we have animal unit days of grazing per animal unit per 1,000 pounds for the fall and the spring, and then totaled. We have our cost saved per animal unit day by grazing cover crops. So essentially, in the fall, essentially how you could look at this is that cover crops were worth $2.40. And in the spring, these cover crops were worth $1.99 per head per day. That average is that is $2.27 per head per day. So then we see our very important figure, which is the value of feed replaced by the cover crops. In the fall, cover crops were valued at $6,315. In the spring, cover crops were valued at $2,500, and our total value of the cover crops over this last year was almost $9,000. So this is an important figure for our complete economic impact analysis, which we will get to very soon. So I'd like to draw your attention to this next section for harvesting cover crops. So this is if a farmer does not graze, but mechanically harvests their cover crops. There are a series of data to enter to then incorporate the costs and value of harvesting covers. For this example, I focused on grazing, not harvesting. So now on row 117, this is our final summary of the economic impact of these cover crops per field and for the whole farm. And then the very right-hand column, we break it down into per acre. So we have in row 126, the total added income for the cover crops. Then in row 135, we have our total added costs. So then we have in row 137, our income minus our costs for each field. And we then break it down per acre. So we see that the grazing cover crops in this example over the entire farm was worth $47.59 per acre, or on a whole farm basis, $5,473. If we were to take out the value of cost share, because I like to look at these numbers with and without cost share, we could remove the cost share up in this previous section. So I am going to take out these values. We now do not have any money, any income from cost share. We go down to our summary, we look at that, and we now have $3,000 instead of about $4,500. And on a per acre value, this is $26 per acre. I have run some farmers' numbers where cost share has really, it's a make or break it situation where the cost share is what was helping them to remain profitable. And in those cases, I've been able to use this tool to pinpoint where most of their expenses were coming from and look at how we could tweak management, whether that's grazing management and needing to get more grazing days out of our cover crops, or whether that is establishment or termination management to minimize cost so they can remain profitable without cost share. So that's why I really like this tool, because we can pinpoint exactly where those costs and where that revenue is generated from. So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint presentation to finish up here and then take some questions. So again, I wanted to really explain the cattle feed requirements. So like I said, what is built into this spreadsheet, we're using a 4% figure for dry matter intake. Like I said, this incorporates 2.5 to 3% of dry matter intake, 0.5% of trampling loss, and 0.5% to 1% buffer. You can also override that function and enter what dry matter intake you feel most comfortable with. This is information taken from Gene Schaefer out of Wisconsin, and I would use probably good forage quality. I wouldn't use excellent forage quality for cover crops. I guess it all depends on the type of cover crop. But I would, be inclined to use a 2.5 or 2.7 dry matter intake, depending on the cow status. So then I just wanted to pull out a couple tables from my actual economic report just to highlight a few numbers. So this is one example, a farmer, Bill Frederick. He's in central western Iowa. And really, this table breaks down the value of cover crops in each fall and each spring. I like keeping the seasons separate because it's good to look at where farmers are really reaping the most benefit. And what I've found through my research is that they're reaping the most economic benefit from fall grazing instead of spring grazing, because that spring grazing window is tight. So that's what this illustrates, that both years fall grazing is really what helped the farmer remain profitable. And this slide is just a full summary of that economic impact for 3 different farms. All of this information, this is distilled down from the full economic tool spreadsheet. But I want to draw your attention to the totals down here. I added total net economic gain or loss, but then I also looked at those same numbers without cost share. And you can see that without cost share, one of these farmers in particular would not have been profitable either year. One farmer would have been profitable one year and not the other year. Mark Schleisman here, who has very great profits, he has been grazing cover crops for over a decade. He is a custom applicator himself, so he has found ways to minimize all of his costs. He's also far surpassed that learning curve of cover crop establishment and cover crop grazing management. So he really has a very good understanding of what he is doing, and he is reaping incredible profits. So you can see, I mean, with cost share, his profits range from $48 to $60 an acre. Without cost share, he's still profitable at around $27 an acre when grazing cover crops. So these 2 tables can be found and are explained in depth within my research report. So just quickly, I wanted to hit on some lessons learned. So this is, like I said earlier, that fall plus winter grazing economically seems to be where you're going to get your greatest benefits. That spring grazing window is tight, especially when you're working within a corn and bean system. And depending on weather, you may or may not get out into the field in the spring. So I also found when I was using this tool with farmer data that there are situations where the cost of spring terminating cover crops can cost more than the actual value of grazing it. So it's really important to look at that number on how much it's going to cost to terminate a cover crop. With that being said, I talked to that farmer who his termination costs trumped his grazing value. And he said there are other values to spring grazing that are harder to quantify. And I will say that this tool does not quantify those values, such as calving on fresh rye pasture and avoiding mud. The cost associated with that could be having a veterinarian come out because there is an issue with a calf in mud in the spring, or just all over treatment costs for illness. So there are other values of spring grazing. I was able to find out by crunching these numbers with the spreadsheet that cost share can really make or break it. So really, cost share, I would recommend using it as training wheels for farmers who are still undergoing this learning curve and new to cover crops, especially grazing cover crops, but they need to find ways to tweak their management to remain profitable without cost share, especially at a time where we don't know how long we can rely on government funding. So also really looking at these numbers shows that early establishment is necessary to getting the most grazing you can out of a cover crop, and also not turning your animals out too early is very important, because this producer that lost money each year without the help of cost share, he seeded late and he grazed too early. There was not enough, I would say there was not enough biomass available for him to graze, and he grazed it anyway. Probably jumped the gun, but then again, it was his first 2 years ever planting cover crops and grazing cover crops. So this tool has really opened his eyes to better cover crop management and grazing management. So with that, I just want to finish up with what is coming down the pipeline. For me, I'm going to be doing a report specific to the economics of grazing cover crops in feedlots. I will add more, another year's worth of data to my cow-calf report, and I will also be doing a report on the economics of solely harvesting cover crops. I will also be in the future incorporating crop yield data into each of these economic analyses. My current report does not incorporate crop yield data. So with that, I would like to entertain any questions. Let's see here in the chat box. And please unmute yourselves and ask questions. I do have a question from Kent that says, is the cost of exterior fencing coming from numbers producers are using to graze corn stalks? That's a great question, Kent. I would have to go back and look at that reference guide that Iowa State put out.
I think you did answer it, Meghan, already, so you don't have to spend time on it. You did when you were going through your where the numbers came from off of one of the other economists' sheet. So you did answer it. Thank you.
So the Iowa State sheet is breaking down different types of fencing, whether that's for corn stalks or for cover crops or for perennial pastures per foot.
So I have another question. Actually, It's probably more of a comment. First of all, my compliments to both Rebecca and Meghan on some very thoughtfully developed and realistic products. That's coming from not an economist. So, but I think they're super powerful tools. This is more of a comment. Your cost saved per head per day, I was pretty blown away by that. Those are some really fabulous numbers, and I find those excellent numbers when talking to producers. So I'm glad to see that in there.
Absolutely, Kent. I will add one comment to that. When you're working with producers, it's very illustrative to look at that cost saved per head per day and then change your tonnage price, your hay price. So, you know, look at an example when hay is $80 a ton, and look at an example when hay is $140 a ton. And that speaks volumes.
And I'm really glad, Meghan, you added the quantifying statements at the end, that there's certain things you're not measuring, and there's other, I don't know if we call them soft values or what. Particularly, you talked about the calving, the value of getting calves out of muddy lots in the spring, and that those numbers aren't there. I think that's crucial when presenting data like this, because people tend to lock in on those numbers and use them one way or another. So thank you for doing that at the end, and I think that's a valuable lesson any of us who work with either of these tools can take with us, and understanding what some of those, I guess I'll call them soft values, are out there. It looks, especially the piece about, you know, here's a more advanced producer, you know, look where they're at with this compared to somebody who's a newbie kind of thing. We're seeing that in other, you talked about the 2% increase in soybeans, and my guess is that number is probably from people who are 1, maybe 2 years into cover crops. I'm hearing reports from producers that are talking about 6 to 10 bushel increases on fields that are 3 and 4 years out with on cover crops versus people who are just 1 or 2 years out on cover crops, so, or no cover crops at all. So those little quantifiers are pretty valuable and important. We're not going to be able to capture everything in any one of these tools. I don't think it's going to get too overwhelming and too mind-boggling. So just a comment on the value of that analysis, and just walking that through with producers is huge.
Thanks, Kit. And one other thing that I forgot to draw your attention to when we were in the Excel file is that on row 140, you can see this note in red. We really wanted to stress that this analysis does not take into account long-term impacts of cover crops on soil health, soil erosion, nutrient retention, or all of those other benefits, like I mentioned with calving on rye in the spring.
I did have one question, not to hog all the time here, on the interior fence labor that the one producer added. Does that take into account subtracting off cost of daily feeding chores? I mean, is there a balance there, or what are the assumptions behind that?
That's a great question. Really, that number is an estimate that is up to the farmer. So if I frame this to farmers to look at added expenses because they're grazing cover crops. So however many hours that adds to their day. I would say that if they did not have to, how would we quantify if they're saving time because they're not daily feeding? I wonder if a negative value could actually be added, or what line it would be most appropriate to add time savings, because there is the possibility in some of these cells to add a negative value if you're making money or saving time. I want to look at where that would be most appropriate to add in. Is that what you were asking, Kent?
Pretty much, because there's trade-offs. Usually most producers finding there's a trade-off. Either you're out on the four-wheeler stringing polywire, or you're scraping manure and feeding cattle. So,
right.
And hauling manure. And sometimes they have to stockpile and haul again because field conditions aren't right. So there can be some huge, cost differences there just on exchanging labor from one to another. I guess I encourage producers to think about it as trading labor, not additional labor, and here's what you're trading kind of thing. So if there could be a way to capture that, then we could put some more hard data to it. I would find that valuable.
That's a great comment. I would love to explore that option with William Edwards, the economist, and see his thoughts on that and how we can capture it.
Hey, Megan, this is Robert Bauer. I have a question on. Hi. You have a line for added investment in fence and waters. When you have that link to the Iowa State, say, reference data about the cost for waters, does that include any information about costs on average for water line, or even to drill a new well? Is that available, linkable?
I would need to look at that fact sheet from Iowa State. I do not think that it would include the cost of drilling a well. If that is an added cost, you would need to estimate that and enter it into the cell. If that is a cost that you want to attribute to the cover crop enterprise.
Yeah, it might be so site by site specific. Maybe it's just not easily averaged or something. I'm just kind of wondering, is that average data out there? You know what I mean?
Good question. I will have to look at that Iowa State fact sheet that we're pulling from to see what costs are incorporated.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions?
All right, well, thank you everybody so much for being part of this. And again, thanks to Rebecca and Megan for presenting in detail. I think that was really helpful. So I did hit the record button and am keeping my fingers crossed that I can actually download a recording and make it available to people. So hopefully that all works, and we'll have this captured for folks who couldn't join this morning. And I think I would also like to send out a short survey to those who were on the webinar this morning to capture comments on it, which I would then convey back to Rebecca and Meghan. Any other last words?
Thank you both for your work. This is these are two really powerful tools.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, everybody have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.